The night was electric with anticipation as the high-rise venue shimmered with dazzling lights, nestled above the sprawling cityscape. The atmosphere was filled with the hum of laughter and clinking glasses, an environment tailor-made for mingling in designer suits and cocktail dresses. For Jason, it felt like a world he didn't belong in. He stood near the edge of the crowd, a clear contrast to the polished, sophisticated people around him. This gala was Mia's world, not his. His wife, always the social butterfly, was radiant in her designer gown, moving effortlessly through the crowd. But something had changed in the way she interacted with him. Her usual warmth seemed distant tonight, replaced by a forced smile and polite gestures. She was enthusiastic about the event, too eager in fact, spending hours preparing, leaving him to question her sudden excitement. Jason couldn't shake the feeling that his presence was more of an afterthought, an accessory to her night out. As he watched her chat animatedly with her colleagues, laughing a little too easily, he felt invisible. She hardly acknowledged him, no smiles or reassuring glances like she used to. A sense of unease crept up on him as he sipped his drink, trying to make small talk with a few unfamiliar faces. But the reality settled in. He was the outsider here. Mia seemed entirely engrossed in her social scene, with not a single glance in his direction. What was going on? Something felt off, but he couldn't pinpoint exactly what. As the evening stretched on, Jason couldn't ignore the unsettling feeling that kept gnawing at him. He watched Mia, now surrounded by a group of her co-workers, laughing with them as though they shared some inside joke. The laughter was a little too loud. The way she leaned in a little too close to her co-workers made him uncomfortable. The more he observed, the more out of place he felt. But it wasn't just Mia's behavior that was bothering him. It was the whispers he kept hearing, low conversations between her colleagues, followed by quick glances in his direction. He caught a few of their eyes darting away the moment he looked back, and a knot tightened in his stomach. Were they talking about him? Or worse, were they talking about Mia? He tried to brush it off, telling himself he was just being paranoid. But then, Mia slipped deeper into her world, completely abandoning him to talk to more guests. Her distance was becoming a physical presence, like an invisible wall separating them. She smiled at him when she caught his eye, but it felt empty, distant. Jason shifted uncomfortably, unable to escape the feeling that something was wrong. The way her laughter seemed so carefree, her body language too relaxed. It made him feel like he was being left behind in a world that wasn't his. The longer he stood there, the more isolated he felt. It wasn't just the party that was creating distance. It was something deeper between them. He could feel it growing, festering in the air. Just as Jason was about to excuse himself and leave, a man approached him, well-dressed, confident, and exuding an air of arrogance that immediately made Jason uneasy. He extended a hand toward Mia, who was standing nearby, talking to a group of her colleagues. "Is this your husband?" the man asked Mia, eyeing Jason up and down as though sizing him up. He didn't wait for an answer before continuing. "Well, I'm Robert, and I'm going to dance with your wife now." Jason's eyes narrowed. The audacity of this man, who clearly had no respect for personal boundaries, was impossible to ignore. Robert's tone was casual, almost as if this was something he had done countless times before. Yet Jason's gut told him this was no innocent request. Without hesitation, Jason stepped forward, a protective instinct rising in him. "I don't think so," Jason said firmly, his voice steady but cold. "You're not going anywhere with my wife." But Robert only grinned, the look on his face mocking Jason's stance. "You don't own her," Robert said, his smirk widening. "She can dance with whoever she wants. Isn't that right, Mia?" Jason's chest tightened with a mixture of rage and disbelief. Mia, instead of supporting him, only looked at him with a casual indifference. "You don't need his permission," she said lightly, as though dismissing Jason's objection as if it were insignificant. The sting of Mia's words cut deep. Jason's mind raced, trying to process what was happening. Was this really happening? In front of all these people, Mia was siding with Robert. Her lack of support in this moment, the public disrespect, Jason felt like the ground had been pulled out from under him. His world, once so sure, was beginning to unravel right before his eyes. Robert, emboldened by Mia's words, didn't hesitate for a second. He took her hand and led her confidently to the dance floor, the crowd parting to let them through. Jason stood frozen for a moment, watching, disbelief clouding his judgment. But as he saw Robert pull Mia closer, the air thick with tension, the undeniable intimacy between them left Jason feeling like a stranger in his own life. The way Robert's hands slid down Mia's back, how he held her a little too tightly. Every move felt like a deliberate act of defiance. And worse, Mia didn't pull away. She didn't look at Jason once. In fact, she seemed to be enjoying herself, lost in the dance with a man who was no more than a colleague. The moment felt like a slap in the face, each second stretching the humiliation further. Jason's stomach turned, a growing sense of anger building deep within him. Every part of him wanted to storm the dance floor, but he held back, still trying to control the searing humiliation that made his blood boil. He could hear the soft whispers of the guests, their surprised glances flicking between him and the couple on the dance floor. The quiet judgments were louder than the laughter that filled the room. But then it happened. Robert's hand slid lower, far below the acceptable boundaries of a casual dance. His fingers lingered too long on Mia's waist, and without shame, he moved his hand further, under her blouse, as if Jason didn't even exist. The sight of Robert's brazen disregard for not just Jason, but for Mia's own dignity, shattered the last thread of Jason's restraint. The rage that had been simmering inside him erupted, and without thinking, he started marching toward the dance floor, his body shaking with fury. He pushed through the crowd, ignoring their shocked looks, until he was standing face to face with Robert. The music blurred, the room fell silent, and everyone's attention turned to the confrontation that was unfolding before them. Jason's voice cracked with fury as he shouted, "Get your hands off her!" The crowd tensed, sensing the tension in the air, and the standoff was set. The simmering animosity between Jason, Robert, and Mia had now reached a boiling point, and everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. The air was thick with tension as Jason strode across the room, his eyes locked on Robert. The crowd parted in silence, sensing the storm that was about to unfold. Jason's voice cut through the noise, low but firm. "Stay away from Mia," he demanded, his words dripping with anger. Robert didn't back down. Instead, he smirked, taunting Jason with a few sharp words that only seemed to fan the flames of his fury. "What are you going to do, Jason? Get in my face like a child?" Robert sneered, his posture arrogantly relaxed as if he had nothing to fear. Jason's fist clenched, his fingers trembling with a mix of rage and frustration. He glanced around, noticing the growing crowd of spectators. There was no way he could let Robert get away with this. With a primal roar, Jason slammed his hand onto a nearby table, shattering it into pieces, sending glass and wood splintering in every direction. The crowd recoiled in shock, but Jason's focus never wavered from Robert. "Back off, Robert," Jason growled, his voice quieter now, yet more dangerous. The silence in the room was deafening, all eyes on the two men. Robert's smile faltered for a moment, but his cocky demeanor remained intact. He took a step forward, his voice dripping with mockery. "Is that all you've got?" he taunted. That was the breaking point. Jason's fist shot out, connecting with Robert's jaw with a sickening thud. Robert's head jerked back, and he staggered, caught off guard by the force of the punch. For a moment, the room held its breath as the two men stood frozen. Jason, his chest heaving with adrenaline, and Robert struggling to regain his balance. The crowd's shock rippled through the space, with some retreating, others staring in wide-eyed disbelief. The stillness was shattered by the sound of approaching footsteps. Security, alerted by the commotion, barged through the crowd and seized Robert, dragging him away from Jason. The once confident man now had a bruise blooming across his face, his arrogance replaced by the sting of humiliation. He tried to wriggle free, but it was no use. The crowd murmured, a wave of gossip spreading like wildfire as Robert was escorted out of the room. Mia, who had been standing at the sidelines, watching everything unfold, now turned on Jason. Her face was flushed with anger, but her eyes betrayed an underlying hurt. "You ruined everything," she snapped, her voice rising above the murmurs. "This night was supposed to be about us, and now you've destroyed it." Her words cut deeper than any punch. She didn't acknowledge her own actions, the way she'd been flirting with Robert, the betrayal that had been bubbling under the surface. Instead, all the blame was laid at Jason's feet. The crowd, witnessing the unraveling of their marriage, shifted uncomfortably, exchanging looks as Mia's words hung in the air. Jason stood frozen, his mind reeling from the turn of events. His relationship, his life, everything felt like it was falling apart before his eyes. The days following the confrontation were a blur for Jason. He couldn't escape the haunting images of the night, the way Mia had turned on him, and the painful weight of his own actions. But it was the quiet moments, the ones where his mind was left to its own devices, that exposed the full depth of the betrayal. Jason began to piece together fragments of information, tiny inconsistencies in Mia's behavior that had once seemed insignificant. The way she had subtly distanced herself from him at the event, her flirty glances towards Robert, the tension hanging thick in the air. The whispers in the room that night weren't just about his outburst. They were about her, too. And as Jason dug deeper, he realized the whispers had been going on for months. A sinking feeling settled in his stomach as he discovered that the affair wasn't a one-time slip-up. It was an ongoing relationship, one that had been hidden right under his nose. His mind wandered back to the subtle hints, the late nights, the unexplained absences, the hollow promises that everything was fine. All of it had been a lie. Then the worst truth hit him. Mia's co-workers had known. For months they had watched the affair unfold, all the while pretending it wasn't happening. Jason's heart felt like it had been ripped out as he realized just how many people had been complicit in keeping him in the dark. His own world had crumbled, and everyone around him had just watched it burn. As the news of Mia's affair began to spread throughout her workplace, the fallout was swift. Her colleagues, once friendly and supportive, began to distance themselves from her. Gossip swirled through the office, and Mia found herself increasingly isolated. The people she had once confided in turned their backs, and the once welcoming environment she had relied on now felt like a foreign land. Her reputation, carefully built over the years, was shattered in the wake of the affair. Meanwhile, Robert's actions weren't going unnoticed. The company's HR department launched an investigation into his misconduct, and the outcome was swift and severe. With multiple reports of inappropriate behavior and now a public altercation, Robert was fired. His once carefully curated career came crashing down as he was escorted out of the building, his arrogance replaced by the cold reality of his actions. Both Mia and Robert were left to pick up the pieces of their lives, their worlds unraveling in the wake of their choices. The consequences were just beginning, and neither of them could escape the fallout from the affair. The morning after the confrontation felt surreal. Jason had barely slept, his mind racing with the chaos of the previous days. But as he sat alone in his living room, something inside him shifted. His heart, still heavy with hurt, began to harden with resolve. He couldn't let Mia's betrayal define him. He couldn't let her manipulation continue any longer. Without hesitation, Jason filed for divorce, It was a decision that carried the weight of years of heartbreak and deceit, but it was a decision he knew he had to make. Mia had broken something irreparable between them, and the trust that had once held their marriage together was now gone. Jason was no longer willing to sacrifice his self-respect for the sake of a relationship that had never been honest. In the days that followed, he found himself reflecting on the magnitude of his choice. The emotional toll was heavy, and he couldn't shake the image of what his life could have been. The pain of betrayal was sharp and raw, but it was also a reminder of how far he'd come. In that decision to file for divorce, Jason felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: empowerment. It was the first time in years he was putting himself first. Jason realized that walking away wasn't just about escaping Mia's deceit. It was about reclaiming his own life. He wasn't a passive player in his own story anymore. He had taken control. The liberation he felt, though bittersweet, was profound. It wasn't an easy path, but it was the right one. As Jason processed the aftermath of his decision, a deeper understanding began to settle within him. He saw the ways in which he had allowed himself to be diminished, to be treated as less than he deserved. Through this painful experience, Jason learned the importance of self-respect and self-worth. He understood now that he had been living for someone else, seeking validation from a person who didn't value him. But in walking away, he learned to value himself once again. It was a painful but necessary step toward personal growth. Jason understood that he didn't need Mia's love or approval to feel whole. He was enough, just as he was. Months passed and Jason's heart healed, bit by bit, as he reflected on everything that had transpired. He had learned painful but invaluable lessons about loyalty, love, and respect. He knew now that he couldn't control another person's feelings or actions, but he could control how much of himself he was willing to lose for them. One evening, sitting with a close friend, Jason shared his final reflection. You can't control someone's loyalty, but you can control how much of yourself you're willing to lose for them, he said, his voice steady but reflective. It was a piece of wisdom forged in the fire of his own heartbreak. He emphasized how crucial it was to know one's worth and set boundaries. If you're not careful, he continued, you'll give so much of yourself to someone who doesn't appreciate it that you forget who you are. And when you're left with nothing, you can't blame them. It's on you for letting it go that far. Jason had learned that walking away from toxic relationships wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a sign of strength. It was a decision to choose himself, to protect his own heart, and to reclaim his dignity. Through it all, he had found not just the courage to walk away, but the wisdom to never look back. Jason took a deep breath, the weight of his journey settling within him, and turned his attention to those listening. I want you to ask yourself one simple question. What are you worth? He said, his voice steady, carrying the depth of his own reflection. When you know your worth, you stop accepting less than you deserve. You set boundaries. You protect your heart, and you never settle for anything less than respect. He paused, letting the words sink in. It's easy to get lost in relationships, to lose yourself in trying to make someone else happy. But the truth is, you are the most important person in your own story. If you're in a relationship, whether with a partner, a friend, or anyone, you have to ask yourself, is this love or is this sacrifice? Are they lifting you up or are they pulling you down? Jason smiled softly, a hint of encouragement in his eyes. I hope you'll take the time to reflect on your own worth, your own boundaries, and your own happiness. Life is too short to waste on people who don't appreciate the value you bring. He leaned in slightly, his tone warm yet resolute. If you've found something meaningful in this story, if it's resonated with you in any way, I encourage you to subscribe. Stay with us for more stories that speak to the heart, that remind us of who we truly are and what we deserve. With one last lingering glance, Jason's voice softened, leaving the audience with a thought to carry with them. You deserve to be loved in a way that honors your worth. Never forget that.